So apparently you made it back to Robot Cantina. Kind of puts the pressure on me. Great. All right, roll camera 5 and action. So far, the 420 Big Block Predator engine has performed pretty good, all things considered. But how does it compare to a modified 212cc small block that we built and tested in episode 7? Well, a lot of people have asked for the dyno numbers, and I'm curious myself. So today we're going to roll back the clock and take a look at the little 212cc engine that got our street legal go-kart up to 54 miles per hour. You see, we assembled the engine and immediately installed it in the car and did a series of road tests. The short story is we managed to meet and exceed our 50 mile per hour goal with the little engine, and then we moved on to the 420 Big Block. So way back in episode 7, we put a modified 212cc engine together with some select off-the-shelf components, like this ARC billet connecting rod, a performance camshaft, and stiffer valve springs. Now for the cylinder head, we used a genuine Honda unit that has a smaller combustion chamber for a boost in compression, and the valves were quality aftermarket stainless steel units. We topped off the engine with a genuine copy of a Mikuni VM22 carburetor. These carbs have a 26mm throat, and at wide open throttle there's no restrictions like in a typical butterfly type throttle. Of course, we jetted the carb and bumped the ignition timing for maximum effect, and the details can be found in episode 7 if you're curious. Now the engine was originally built to be indestructible, and that's why we chose the ARC billet flywheel. However, for our application, the flywheel with its integral cooling fans couldn't keep our small block 212 cool enough when running 100% full power for long periods of time. Now, I'm sure the flywheel would be fine for a go-kart or a mini bike, but it's not for a 1,400-pound car, if that makes any sense. So the camshaft was recommended by Dyno Cams after a brief exchange of emails. I don't recall the particulars, but it looks every bit like a camshaft, and for the camshaft crowd, here's the cam card. Now, like I said, there's a lot of folks that ask just how much power did that little engine make. Now, I don't know, but I reckon we'll find out. So here's the modified 212 engine exactly the way it was in episode 7. We're running a full exhaust and an air filter, but we'll also do some dyno runs without the exhaust and the filter, just for fun. Of course, this is the driver's seat. Not much to see other than I like to keep a robust blast shield between me and whatever is being tested. Now, we've never had an explosion, but you never know. For simplicity, the dyno's hand-operated, but all the information is electronically captured with a mini data logger and a laptop computer. And again, we'll show you all the parts once we finish the dyno runs. Now, I reckon I should shut up and let's see how much power this thing makes. Now, we always do multiple dyno runs. Typically 5 runs is more than enough to gather and verify data. Of course, we won't show you all the runs, but the camera is always running, just in case the engine explodes. Let's see if removing the air filter has any effect. The smoke you see is the blow-by coming from the crankcase breather. And here you can see at wide open throttle, the counterfeit Mikuni has no restrictions to impede the flow of air. Okay, let's remove the muffler. Ooh, hot, hot, hot. Now I'm going to share a trade secret. The brake pads get a squirt of WD-40 between runs. Now, it seems counterproductive, but this helps to smooth the engagement of the brake. The WD-40 burns off after a handful of runs. Okay, let's look at some data. With the air filter and muffler, the engine makes a whopping 13.19 horsepower, and it pretty much goes off the chart. As a matter of fact, the engine will peak at 7,500 RPM before the valves start floating. For torque, we generated 15.29 pounds-feet at 3,300 RPM, but overall the torque seems more or less consistent from 2,800 to 3,700 before it slowly starts to drop off. Now both the torque and the horsepower come in kinda soft on the low end, but build rapidly and drop off somewhere off the chart. Yeah, I know I could rescale the chart, but I'm lazy and this engine's clearly a screamer. Oh, I guess I should mention we're looking at raw dyno data. The uncorrected 13.19 horsepower translates to 14.78 horsepower when you apply the SAE formula. I don't know, it seems like that's cheating, especially when using a prony dyno that was designed before math was invented. And yeah, I have to apologize to the metric crowd. All this stuff is in freedom units. I don't know what it is you folks use over there, but no doubt I would get it wrong if I translated it. So you're on your own today. So without the air filter, the horsepower drops to 12.84. Looks like we lose a bit of power, and that's likely due to the mixture being off. In our case, the filter seems to be causing the engine to run a little bit richer, and as a bonus we get extra power. Now the combination of the jets and the air filter seem right on, and that's not bad given the jet size was more or less a guess. Now the torque drops off a bit, but it's more or less the same with or without the filter. So in the right circumstances, the air filter can add power if the carburetor is jetted right. Let's look what happens when we remove the muffler. Well, it doesn't look good for our hero. Again, we've lost a tiny bit of power, and again, that's likely due to the mixture. Yeah, the exhaust system directly affects the air-fuel mixture. In our case, it's just a tiny bit. But keep in mind, this is not a normal Predator muffler. This is a sports bike muffler, and way back in the day, I do recall this engine ran a lot better with this muffler. And it does a decent job toning down the exhaust note. Now, it looks like the torque dropped off a little bit in the absence of the muffler. Not much, but every little bit helps. So overall, the numbers look good, especially with the air filter and the muffler installed. And if we go back and review the performance data, this screamer of an engine proved it was a contender out on the Badlands with a 54 mph top speed. But at the drag strip, yeah, this car was a slug. Nope, it couldn't get out of its own way during the 0 to 30 runs. As a matter of fact, the modified 212cc engine performed worse than the stock 212, and in stock form this little engine only makes 6.65 horsepower according to our dyno. Now we've come a long way in development, and just last week we got some remarkable numbers at the New Hillbilly Proving Grounds. The 420 Big Block is essentially a stock engine. Yeah, it has EFI, but that really isn't a power adder. The EFI is basically the same as rejetting the carburetor as far as fuel delivery goes. And the only real mod the engine has is the Speeduino advances the ignition to 27 degrees, which is the same as an offset flywheel key that we used in the past on the smaller engine. I guess what I'm saying is the 420 and the 212cc engine make about the same horsepower, at least on paper. The difference is the 420 makes its power and gobs the torque on the low end, while the 212cc engine makes its horsepower on the top end. Now with the way the car is geared and with the addition of the torque converter, we can take better advantage of the 420's low end power. And that's how we're getting better results. I guess some folks may wonder if we could have tuned the drivetrain specifically for the modified 212 engine, for better performance at the drag strip. Well, in episode 10, we sort of tried that. What we tried was a torque converter modification. The idea was to take apart the converter and lighten up its internal weights. The modified torque converter would allow the 212cc engine to wind up so it could make its horsepower on the top end while the converter slowly went through its range. Well, what we ended up with was a disaster on the side of the road when the intake manifold broke. Now, the broken manifold had nothing to do with the converter mod, and I hope that's obvious. Nope. The manifold broke because it was pretty much cheap crap sourced from Amazon. Unfortunately, that pretty much ended the 212cc engine experiments because we ran out of time and we were also working on the 420 stuff. So I guess the modified 212cc engine ain't no good for a car, and that's obvious whether it's modified or not. But this engine is a real screamer, and I think it's going to find a home in something more appropriate. So how does a prony dyno work? Well, the simplest answer is just Google it. Let's see, prony dyno. Meh. Oh, here's a nice picture. Okay, so it looks like all you need is a brake, a torque arm, and a scale. Now this picture doesn't show it, but we also need a way to count the RPMs. An abacus, perhaps? Anyway, this thing's made out of wood, leather, and it's nailed together. I think we can improve on this a little bit. So this is a modern-day equivalent of the prony dyno. Now this gizmo is deceptively simple looking, and at first glance it almost appears like it was made by a hillbilly in a garage with common garden tools. Well, that ain't far from the truth. You see, I have a PhD. Not one of those. A PhD, a post hole digger. Tough crowd today, tough crowd. So anyway, our modern prony dyno uses a disc brake and caliper to apply the load to the engine. Now all I have to do really is push down on this lever to slowly engage the brake while holding the throttle wide open, and we're able to put a massive load on the engine. The tiny caliper is from a 50cc motorcycle, and it has more than enough grip to slow down the engine. And as I showed earlier, we actually shoot WD-40 on the brakes to reduce the grip for a smooth deceleration of the engine. So that covers the brake. For the torque arm, well, we got one, but it's hidden behind all the stuff. So the brake caliper that we just discussed is connected to a hidden torque arm, and if we take a look below the dyno, we can see part of the torque arm sticking out. So that covers the torque arm. And in a moment or two, we will dig deeper to expose the torque arm. So the older prony dyno uses an actual scale to measure force. However, on the modern dyno, we use a strain or force gauge to electronically convert the force into an electrical signal. So that pretty much covers the scale. Now, to measure RPM, we use an inductive proximity sensor, and we count the holes in the rotor as they pass under the sensor. With a bit of math, we can convert that into RPM. So let's go through that again real quick. The rotor is connected to the engine and spins when the engine's running. Jimbo holds the throttle wide open and applies the brake. The caliper squeezes down on the spinning rotor and transfers the energy to the hidden torque arm. Down below, the torque arm, which is connected to the caliper, transfers the energy to a force gauge, and Bob's your uncle. It's just that simple. Now, the whole process is recorded on a data logger, and we can extrapolate the horsepower by using some simple math along with the data we collected. Pretty much that's it. Now, no doubt there are folks in the audience who know how a prony dyno works and want to see how the magic happens, and more specifically, how I managed to connect the torque arm, because they know there's literally not enough room to fit all that stuff in a nice little package. So how did Jimbo do it? Well, that's next. So to expose the torque arm, we'll need to pull the prox sensor, the rotor, and the caliper. Give me a moment. Okay, and guess what? You still can't see how the torque arm is connected, so I reckon more stuff has to come off. But before we do that, let me give you a peek at how it moves. Now, in order for this quick demonstration, I also had to remove the strain gauge below the dyno. That way I can show an exaggerated movement of the torque arm. Normally it only moves a few thousandths of an inch. Okay, so now we can see the caliper bracket is definitely connected to the torque arm. So let me remove this aluminum plate. Now this will be a bit of magic because pulling the plate will cause the whole thing to fall apart. So I pulled the plate, and off camera I reassembled all the bits. And now we can see how it works. The trick is the torque arm is suspended by 8 roller skate bearings, and I'm also using the engine block as part of the dyno. So that's pretty much how we do it. The engine block is actually part of the dyno. Pretty clever. So here's another shot on how the torque arm is suspended and how it moves. Now let's put the dyno back together and take a look at the calibration. So this dyno is pretty much made of random fabricated parts and a few off-the-shelf components. The most important part of this whole assembly is the calibration arm. Now this part is probably the only thing I measured when I built this dyno. So this thing is what I use to calibrate the dyno in foot-pounds. Oh, my bad, and I have to apologize. The calibration arm also has a counterweight that I forgot to install when I filmed this. Normally the arm is balanced when going through the calibration process. So for this dyno we calibrate it to 20 foot-pounds by using 2 10-pound slugs of steel and also a 5-pounder. We do the calibration in a few steps to confirm the load cell is linear, and we do this every time we use the dyno. And here you can see the 2 10-pounders hanging from the calibration arm. So at this point we can take a look at the data log equipment. Looks like we have a 24-volt power supply, an amplifier for the load cell, a signal conditioner box that contains a Zener diode, a few resistors, and a capacitor. Now these passive components clean up the signal from the proximity sensor that we use to measure RPM data. The data logger is a DL1100, and it's a multi-channel USB front end that converts the signals into something the laptop can read and record. It's made by DataQ. And here you can see the last step in calibration, where we suspend a 20-pounder from the calibration arm and read the raw voltage from the load cell. From this point it's just math, and we ain't getting into that. So that's pretty much it for today. I hope some of you folks found the dyno and how it works to be somewhat interesting. And next week we'll jump back into tuning the street legal go-kart for more speed. So see you next time.